Good morning. Welcome to Behind the Scenes on Planet Doug for Wednesday, November 15th. It is about 10:30 in the morning. Coffee number 2 on its way. We'll see how my voice does. I've had a bit of a sore throat, and I may not be able to speak that well or for that long. We'll see what happens. Something I've noticed is that since I've been in Port Dickson, I've shot a lot of these behind-the-scenes videos, and I've shot them in the same place. So despite technology problems, I've gotten to the point where I set up really fast, because I know exactly what I'm doing now, like in terms of this room, in terms of the lighting, in terms of the audio levels, putting the camera on a tripod on this little stool that I have in the room, making sure it doesn't fall over, connecting it to the tripod at the right height, using my 12 to 35 millimeter lens. I set it at exactly 25 millimeters. So all these things have become habitual. So now when I wake up and I do want to shoot one of these videos, you know, within a couple of minutes, I'm all set up and ready to go. It just takes some time to get used to the gear that you have in the setting that you're using. And then once you get a rhythm going, you know, it's like bing, 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 screw it in, turn it on, and here you go. You're ready to go. Of course, I have all my usual technology problems. I'm still struggling with charging the batteries for this Olympus for some reason. I still don't know where the problem is. It's the batteries are too old, or the charger isn't working, or the camera itself isn't reading battery levels accurately anymore. I don't know where the issue is. And of course, the battery door on the Olympus, the lever has fallen off, the lever that locks it. But I've sort of gotten around that problem. I was talking before about how I would just take the lever, this tiny piece of plastic, and I insert it into place and open the battery door, and then the lever falls off, but at least I have the battery door open. Then I change batteries, you know, put the new battery in, and then close the door, and I take that little plastic lever, I put it on the tip of my finger, and I'm like slowly trying to get it into place, and then once I'm holding it there with my finger, I can try and move it and then close the battery door again. But I've sort of skipped all of that now, because I've realized that I don't really even need the battery door, because when you push the battery into place, there's a locking mechanism, a little lever that clicks underneath the battery and holds it. So now when I'm shooting one of these videos, I just leave the battery compartment wide open. The flap, you know, that locks into place, I just leave it open, because I don't need to close it. The battery makes contact without it, and the little plastic locking mechanism at the bottom clicks into place without the door. So the door is more of a convenience and a way to keep it waterproof. You know, it's like a waterproof seal. And here in this room, I don't have to worry about that. So now I just leave it open. And when I put the camera away in its case, even then I don't close the battery door anymore. I just use a plastic band. So now I've got like a $1,000 camera. Yeah, I think it cost $1,000 US or more when it was new. So we'll call it a $1,000 camera, and I'm holding it together with a elastic band. That's kind of funny. And the other technology problem I ran into is brand new. I've been using this tablet quite a bit. It's a Galaxy Tab S5e, I believe. It's seen a lot of heavy usage, and it goes, you know, I have it inside this cover. And the way this works is, you know, you have this cover, and then here's your tablet, very thin and lightweight, but it has magnets on the back. So it doesn't click into place, it actually just is held in place by magnets. And that system works really, really well. And then you can take this cover and it turns into like a triangle as a base, you know, so you can put it on a table and prop it up. And then I've gotten in the habit sometimes of holding it by this triangular base, you know, kind of like this. If for whatever reason maybe I'm lying down in bed and I want to hold the screen up above me, instead of gripping it with two hands, I'll just be holding this triangular base and then doing it like this. And then the other day I was doing it, holding it like this, luckily while I was sitting on this bed, and the entire front of the tablet fell off. So the rear of it, where all the electronics are, was held in place with the magnets, but the front, the LCD screen or OLED screen, whatever it is, with the screen and all the cables and the wires attached to the screen, the whole thing fell off. So like nothing broke, I don't think, but it's just a matter of the glue or the seal, whatever it is that holds the two halves of the tablet together, came apart just over time, over with heat and humidity. And I carried this everywhere, like all over Sumatra and all over Thailand on a scooter, bouncing up and down for thousands of kilometers on a scooter in Thailand, and then in Sumatra on my bicycle and scooter there. So it's just been bouncing around. I carry it around in a pannier bag. So it's seen some pretty hard usage, and I guess it reached its limit. And the front just, I don't dare let go right now, because if I do, the front will just fall off. And luckily I caught it, because if it fell free, I think it would have torn out all the cables. Just the weight of the screen would have ripped the cables loose, but I managed to catch it. And then now I just sort of pinched it back into place. And now I have to figure out a way to kind of make sure it stays in place. And probably what I'll just do is add some Scotch tape, because, once you pinch it back into place, it's fine. It looks fine, but at any moment it can suddenly just fall off. And if it happens at the wrong time and I don't catch it, it will destroy the tablet. But I think all it really needs is a little bit of Scotch tape on each edge, strategically placed so as not to cover up any buttons or speakers or memory card slots or magnets, just a couple of small pieces, 4 of them, 1 on each side. I think it'll hold it in place. But yeah, it was really funny when the front of it just fell right off. But luckily I managed to catch it. So those are my technology stories for this morning. A quick pop culture roundup. In a recent behind-the-scenes video, I predicted who was going to win in UFC 295, which happened this past weekend. There was a interim heavyweight championship fight between Sergey Pavlovich and Aspinall, Tom Aspinall from the UK. Sergey Pavlovich is from Russia, I believe. And they were fighting for the interim heavyweight championship. And it's interim because John Jones is the current heavyweight champion, but he suffered an injury. He was scheduled to fight Stipe Miocic for the real heavyweight championship. But that fight was delayed because of his injury, and so they replaced the John Jones-Stipe Miocic fight with this fight between Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. So that was for the interim heavyweight championship. So that was the co-main event. And then for the main event, there was a light heavyweight championship between Yuri Prohaska and Alex Pereira from Brazil. And for those two fights, I predicted that Aspinall would win the interim heavyweight championship and that Alex Pereira would win the light heavyweight championship. And I was right for both of them. And I was sort of right about how they would each win as well. So you're looking at an upcoming UFC MMA analyst. All my predictions have turned out to be true. So maybe I need a new career in betting on MMA, and I can start winning some money that way. And I also watched a really big, very popular movie called Spider-Man Across the Multiverse. And a short story there. I loved it, thought it was a great movie. I plan on watching it again because just like the original, there was the first movie was called Spider-Man Into the Multiverse. This is the sequel, Spider-Man Across the Multiverse. I really wish camera companies and movie producers would name their movies and name their cameras with better names so I can keep track of them all. It gets very confusing. But the original, Into the Spider-Verse, is an animated film about, it's an origin story for Spider-Man, but with a new take. It's animated in a very modern, very high energy, creative style of animation. And the new Spider-Man is not Peter Parker, it's a guy called Milo Morales. And it's an amazing movie, loved it a lot. And then this second one, the sequel, Across the Spider-Verse, is exactly the same. The same animation style, the same characters. It's just continuing the story of the first one, but with that same imaginative style of animation. But they've taken it to the next level. There's so much going on. It was just insane. So you can't follow all of the animation. There's things going on in the background. You could probably watch this movie 10 times and keep seeing new things. And I don't know how true the story is, but I remember seeing some articles online saying that animators for this movie were quitting by the hundreds because they just couldn't take it anymore. Like 100 of them would just quit en masse because of the heavy workload of doing all this animation. There was just too much to do. And yeah, I can only imagine how much work went into it. But setting aside the animation, the storyline was good and very entertaining. Characters are very engaging, feel very real and grounded to me. Each character is very distinct. You feel something for all of the characters. And that's saying something because we are talking about a Spider-Man multiverse. And I've talked before about how I'm suffering from multiverse fatigue. Like Marvel, Loki, every story now, Doctor Strange, they all are based on the theory of the multiverse, even Rick and Morty, right? Where there are, infinite, basically, not thousands, not millions, not billions or trillions, but infinite universes. And once you introduce that into a story, along with time travel, the logistics of storytelling just blow up exponentially. The story can quickly get out of control and lose all meaning as well, because once you have trillions of universes, each one a slight variation from the other one, why would you care about anything? Rick and Morty is the ultimate example of that, because Rick, in his adventures, he's constantly destroying entire universes and therefore the planet Earth. And then it doesn't really bother him that much, because if he wipes out the planet Earth and wipes out all the people on it, including his own family, it doesn't really matter that much to him, because he just goes to the next universe, which has nearly a perfect copy of the Earth he destroyed, and his family is there, and now he can just destroy one Earth and just go to the next one, and everything is back to normal. The same family, the same characters, the same Earth, the same universe, right? He complains about that only in that it's becoming more and more difficult to find perfect copies of his own Earth. Because every time he destroys an Earth, like every time he destroys a universe, he has to find a universe that's as close as possible. And if he keeps destroying more and more and more of them, it becomes harder to find a perfect copy. And that's the only reason he complains about it. Everything else is exactly the same. It's like if you're living your life here on this Earth, and this Earth, is destroyed through your actions. Your family is killed, all your friends are dead. Well, you just hop over to the next Earth, and your family and friends are all back again. And it's like it made no difference to you. So this whole idea of the multiverse makes storytelling complicated, and it removes all the stakes from the story. And I've been worried about that. I'm not even bothering to watch the new season of Loki, because I don't think I can get invested in all the time travel shenanigans. They're all protecting the prime timeline, and it's all I just don't care. The scale is too big, and there are no more stakes anymore. However, Spider-Verse is an exception, because they did a very clever thing that, yes, they introduced the idea, or the whole story is based on the multiverse. Even the very first one is Spider-Man into the multiverse. But they did something really fun with it, where they based every multiverse on the events of Spider-Man and his life. And we all know the story of Spider-Man, right? Peter Parker, he's a nerd in high school. He always gets beat up by the jocks. You know, he's got bullies that beat him up. He's always falling in love with Gwen Stacy, and she's not going to even look at him because she's a beautiful, popular girl, and Peter's a nerd. He's in the photography club. And then, of course, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider. He gets Spider-Man superpowers. Uncle Ben is killed because of his inaction. He feels guilty about being responsible for his uncle's death. And then we've got Aunt May. You know, Uncle Ben gives him his classic line, with great power comes great responsibility. We've seen that play out so many times in cartoons, comic books, movies, and TV shows. Like, I've seen the Spider-Man origin story probably a dozen times, if not 24 times in my lifetime. It's become a cliche, you know, it's almost become a joke. And then Into the Spider-Verse took that idea and created a multiverse where in every single universe there is a variation of Spider-Man who follows the exact same sequence of events, but with a twist. And they go so far with it, they're so creative. So, for example, there's like a dinosaur universe where Spider-Man is a T-Rex. There's a Lego universe where Spider-Man is a Lego Spider-Man. And then there are ones like a Renaissance Spider-Verse, where everybody looks like a Leonardo da Vinci drawing on parchment. They're all made out of brown parchment and live in 2 dimensions, and yet they live and fight exactly as if they're in a 3-dimensional world, but they look like a Leonardo da Vinci drawing on brown parchment paper. There's a film noir Spider-Verse that was in the original, where Spider-Man is basically all in black and white, and he behaves and speaks like he's in a film noir movie, you know, like a B detective, where you've got a hard-drinking, depressed detective in a dingy office, and then a glamorous woman comes into his office and says she has a case for him, and he has to solve the murder of her husband or something. This whole film noir, and there's an entire universe where everybody, including Spider-Man, is film noir. And then there's a Japanese universe where Spider-Man is a young anime, like a girl anime character with a robot. There's so much imagination in it. There's even a Porky Pig Spider-Man. They go crazy with it. And then when you get into this new movie, Spider-Man Across the Multiverse, they just went insane. So now we're dealing with thousands of universes, and each one has a unique Spider-Man, that each one is living out the canon events of Spider-Man's life. And it's just so much fun, and there's so much going on. And I found, despite all of that craziness, I still found the story compelling. So yeah, I recommend it. I'm going to be watching Across the Spider-Verse again. And what I didn't realize is that it's actually a trilogy, or maybe it's more than a trilogy, because Spider-Man 2, Across the Multiverse, ends with a message saying, his adventures continue in the third one, which I believe is going to be called Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse, whatever that means. So the story is continuing. But even though it was a bit of a cliffhanger ending, it didn't bother me either, because the story of episode 2, Across the Multiverse, they really seemed to tell a good story, and they pulled all the threads of the storyline together at the end in a satisfying way. But then they introduced a twist at the very end, and that is going to continue for part 3, and the main villain of part 2 is continuing into part 3. So we still have that to look forward to. And the main villain of part 2 is mind-blowing as well. As if, multiverse is not enough, you've also got this villain that introduces a kind of physics complexity that is hard to keep track of. You're watching the animation, and they use his powers in such a creative way, the way he can alter reality and the laws of physics, that you're like, what is going on? And you can't keep track of the fighting, because so many creative things happen during the fight and in the background. You kind of have to watch it. You can watch it one time and enjoy it because it doesn't matter, but it stands up to rewatching because the story is so entertaining. They're like, as one of the Peter Parkers says at one point, Spider-Men are all funny. That's part of their character. So that's canon for spider people, spider creatures across all the multiverses. One of their key characteristics is that they're all quippy. They all make funny jokes. They have quips. And so they're all, very lighthearted. They're fighting for the fate of the universe, but they still do it in a lighthearted, funny way, in a very human way. So yeah, I quite enjoyed it. And then, but yeah, it's almost too much to handle. As I said, the multiverse and the villain having this power that he has that makes things even more confusing. Your brain almost explodes, trying to keep track of it all. This is a somewhat special segment of Behind the Scenes because it combines a podcast with a YouTube story with kind of current affairs. And it all started with a podcast from Radiolab. I heard this podcast a couple of years ago or several years ago, maybe even a decade ago, because it's an older one, but they re-released it because it was one of their more popular podcasts. They do that from time to time. They take old ones and then re-release them, but then they update the story, which I really enjoy. And they're usually so good that they stand up to repeat listens anyway. It's actually a 3-part podcast called the Border Trilogy, and it focuses on the border between the United States and Mexico, where so many people from around the world, of course, are trying to cross that border and enter the United States illegally. And that's a huge topic, of course, in the media around the world. There's been so much attention focused on that, particularly when Donald Trump was elected president and he had the slogan about build the wall. And he was feeding on the fears that you have in the United States about the country being overrun with illegal immigrants, mainly from South America, but from around the world. So it's a big topic that has been in the zeitgeist for a decade at least, longer than that. It's been around for my entire lifetime, basically. So yeah, the whole idea of people fleeing their country, whether they're fleeing, political instability, violence, or economic insecurity, and then and war, of course. We've got all the refugees from Ukraine right now. Before that, we had a massive, a surge of refugees from Syria, the civil war going on there. I mean, you can just go around the world, name a war, name an economic collapse, and then you've got people trying to leave that country and go to another country where they can get a better job for their family and, take care of their family and for the future of their family, just looking for basically survival. So yeah, it's a big story around the world, and of course, like everyone, I've been following it pretty closely. And perhaps I follow it more closely than the average, just because I have been spending a lot of time in different countries, and every country has its own migration crisis going on. There's always some kind of group of people trying to enter that country, whether legally or illegally, and then you get refugee camps, you get immigration rounding up people who are working illegally in this country or living there illegally, and should they send them home? What should they do with them? Every country you go to, they have their own story about that. So I come across it all the time, and as I travel around the world, of course, I'm always faced with the struggle of getting a visa for that country with a time limit on it. I have to meet all the qualifications for my tourist visa, whatever they may be. Have to show you have a certain amount of money. You have to give them an address where you're going to be staying, the hotel where you're going to be staying. You have to show you have enough money to stay in the country. You have to show you have a ticket out of the country. I mean, it can be a lot of work as a tourist being able to go to another country. So I end up thinking about that all the time. And then whenever I see a story online about people who entered a country illegally, and then they end up working in that country, and then they get arrested and deported. I have a personal stake in those storylines because we're kind of doing the same thing, and I end up thinking about my ability with my passport from Canada. I can go just about anywhere I want, assuming I have enough money. I have the freedom to travel, and then that makes these people who also want to go to another country, whether to get a job or go to school or just to live there, they're sort of kindred spirits of mine. And they may come from a country where they can't get a visa to enter this or that country, and they can't even get a passport, which is part of this story that I'm going to be telling in a minute. So anyway, it's a big story that I've been following for most of my life. And then this Radiolab podcast I listened to over the last couple of weeks called Border Trilogy, focusing on the border between the United States and Mexico. And the thesis of that story is interesting, and it feeds into my YouTube story. And the thesis is basically that deterrence doesn't work. I mean, Radiolab is, I'm sure you would describe it as a left-leaning sort of organization. Most podcasts are, Radiolab or Freakonomics or anything from NPR. Most of these things tend to be liberal, left-leaning, so they have a certain perspective, of course, and Radiolab does have that. And they talk about how deterrence doesn't work, that if you have hundreds of thousands of people leaving one country trying to get into the United States, you can put up any kind of deterrent you want. Donald Trump's border wall is an example, that you can build that wall, but it won't work. As soon as you build it, people will climb over it, they'll tunnel under it, they'll smash it, they'll break it down. So that deterrent won't really work. You can put in any kind of barrier or system of deterrence you want, but deterrents don't really work. It won't stop people from trying to come. It will only change how they do it. And the Radiolab podcast focused on the US-Mexico border, as I said, where there were areas of the border where most of the illegal migration was taking place. So most of these people were crossing the border illegally in these areas that were close to cities, the easier areas where they can get across. And then there were cases in the United States where they decided to put barriers in place so that people could no longer cross in those easy areas, and that was supposed to stop the illegal immigrants from coming into the United States. But it didn't stop them, according to this. That's, like I said, that's the thesis of this podcast story. It didn't stop them. All it did was push the migrants from crossing over the safe areas. Now they had to go around and then try to cross through more dangerous areas. So in terms of this story, they were talking about all the migrants, they'd be crossing these rivers that separate two cities, for example, a safe area to cross, but now they couldn't do that anymore, and then they had to go way off in another direction and cross through a desert because it was still open. And then as they cross through the desert, of course, now they're facing hardships, and lots of people are dying. So they're finding bodies of illegal immigrants all over this desert area now because they're trying to, walk through this desert, and they don't understand the physical difficulties of that walk, and they don't bring enough water with them. They're abandoned by their, coyotes, the smugglers who are bringing them in, just sort of get them into the desert and then abandon them. And again, we're not always talking about young, physically fit people. We're talking about, mothers, pregnant women, families with young children, and they're just not prepared to get across a desert on foot, and a lot of them are dying. So that leads you back around to this thesis that the deterrent, instead of stopping migration, just forces the migration to take place through more dangerous areas. And that's kind of the story of the Border Trilogy from Radiolab. And then, of course, the whole podcast ends with a discussion of, okay, well, if this doesn't work, what's the solution? Like, what should we do? What's the answer to this constant issue of people wanting to go to a new country and that, attempting to do it legally or illegally, and of course, then you get into the classic battles between the groups who kind of support it, the human rights, more liberal, left-leaning organizations, and then the more conservative approach of just, for them, of course, I think it's a very simple issue for them. They just say, well, just ban it completely, like Donald Trump. Put up the wall, stop it. You can come in you can come in legally, apply for immigration status, or don't come at all. And that's, kind of the hardline conservative approach to the issue. And then you've got the liberal approach, which is a little bit more, well, in those groups, you have people who are really fleeing serious danger and economic hardships that they will die if they don't leave their country. So according to, international law and basic human compassion, you should help these people. If we don't let them into our country, they will die in their own country. So we should follow international law, and they get refugee status and, asylum seekers. It's a very complex issue. So that was my starting point. And because of that, listening to this podcast, I went looking for other stories. And I found there was a report on CNN, for example, a 5-part documentary about the Darien Gap, which is the section of jungle between Panama and Colombia. It's basically, in North and South America, there is something they call the Pan-American Highway, a highway that runs all the way from the tip of, North America in Alaska, through Canada, the United States, Mexico, Central America, all the way down through South America, the Pan-American Highway. But there's actually a gap in the Pan-American Highway of about 60 kilometers. It goes all the way from the far north of North America to the far southern tip of South America, continually, except for this 60-kilometer gap or 70-kilometer gap in the jungle, the northern jungle of Colombia and the southern jungle of Panama, and that area is called the Gap, the Darien Gap, and there's no roads there at all. That area has always fascinated me, and I think it's fascinated travelers forever, because so many people want to travel the full length of North and South America, and then of course you're on your motorcycle and then you get to Panama and it's like, well, now you're stuck. You cannot continue. There is no land road connection between, North and Central America and South America. It kind of boggles the mind. You'd think that just for economic reasons, for reasons of trade, that at some point all the nations, we've got Canada and the United States and Mexico in that group who have, more than enough money and engineering expertise. You'd think they could build a road across 60 kilometers of jungle. I've always thought that. It's like, how can that be so hard? So it's always been a fascinating topic. And then you get, backpackers and travelers, people traveling on motorcycles or bicycles. They reach Panama, they reach the Darien Gap, and now they have to figure out a way to get over the gap. And then, like Itchy Boots, she put her motorcycle on a boat. And of course, she made the crossing legally, got all the necessary permits and visas, and hired a boat. And they took her and her motorcycle across, the ocean from Colombia to Panama. And then you get most people just fly. Most people arrive somewhere in Central America, and then they fly into Colombia and just skip Panama and skip the gap altogether. But then you get some of these hardcore travelers, and they want to go by land through the Darien Gap. So you get some legendary travelers and backpackers over the years who have actually made the hike, the trek through the jungle. And of course, it's known as a very dangerous place, kind of a lawless place. There are, the drug cartels, criminal groups, gangs who live in that jungle area, and there's a risk of getting robbed, killed, kidnapped, all those things. And then you've got the physical difficulties. How do you get through the jungle in terms of food and water, and can you even make it through the mountains and the jungle and the rivers, poisonous snakes? I mean, the Darien Gap is legendary, has developed a reputation for being one of the most dangerous places on the planet. And I've always been fascinated by it just because I do read a lot of travel stories, back in the days of travel books. Now we have internet stories and YouTube stories, and the Darien Gap comes up all the time. And you even have the people, it's a classic way of overcoming the gap is to take on a berth in a private yacht, because you get, the super wealthy of the world, they're all traveling around the world in their sailing ships and in their yachts, and they need crew. And it's kind of a legendary story amongst backpackers to travel to certain harbors in Panama, and then they go to the harbors, go to the docks, and they go from boat to boat to boat, asking all these wealthy people, like, do you need crew? Like, can I get a berth on your boat? I will work for you. And then they will take them by ocean down to Colombia. And that's another way to get over the Darien Gap. And you see, classic travel stories all about that. So yeah, it's a legendary place. And it is in the news a lot these days because of a lot of things going on, that I'll talk about in a minute. But we have migrants from not just South America, but from all over the world making the journey on foot now from Colombia through the Darien Gap into Panama, and they're all trying to get to Mexico and then get to the border with the United States, and then cross the border into the US. So everybody's goal is to get into Mexico and then travel to the border and then make it across the border into the United States. And yeah, so we got a lot of not tourists, backpackers, but we have migrants now going through the Darien Gap. And this is where my podcast current events interests intersect with YouTube stories, because while all this was going on, while I was listening to these Radiolab podcasts, watching all these CNN videos about migrants in the Darien Gap, reading all about it, there's an organization called Human Rights Watch, and they've been focusing heavily on the migration through the Darien Gap. They've been doing all kinds of studies, and you can find all kinds of information on their website. It's hrw.org, and a very informative article that they've posted. If you look for it, it's called How the Treacherous Darien Gap Became a Migration Crossroads of the Americas. And it's a very recent story, came out in October of 2023, and Human Rights Watch actually sent reporters to the Gap to do all this research, and the result of that is all in this article. And I read through all of their articles, and I had all this information in my head, and then I stumbled across the fact that Bald and Bankrupt did this exact same thing. So Bald and Bankrupt, we all know him. He's probably one of the most famous travel YouTubers around the world, a very popular one. And he came up with this idea. I'm sure he's monitoring the news. He knows all about current events, and he knows what is going to be of interest to people on YouTube. And he saw how much attention was focused on the Darien Gap and the migrants. And he says that like 2 years ago, he came up with this idea, or it was actually suggested to him by a friend of his, that he should do that journey himself and document it on YouTube as a series of videos. So he decided to do this, and he's doing it right now. He's posting videos right now. And his idea was to start in Venezuela, because the majority of the migrants are now coming from Venezuela. This is a new thing that I'll talk about in a minute because of the economic collapse in Venezuela. So a lot of people are leaving Venezuela and just trying to find anywhere they can go. They're traveling all over South America to different countries. And then, of course, the goal for most of them is to make it all the way to the United States. So it's mainly Venezuelans who are going through the Darien Gap right now. And Bald decided to start in Venezuela, and his idea is to travel just like the migrants all the way up through, Colombia, the Darien Gap, Panama, Central America, Mexico, and then he wants to go all the way to the border with the United States, and he's going to end his journey, with touching the border wall. He wants to end it with a classic image of him at the U.S. border and then putting his hand on the actual wall, separating the two countries now. So that is his idea. And he's posted 2 videos so far. The first one is called I Joined the World's Most Dangerous Migrant Trail. That's video number 1. And it's all about basically traveling from Venezuela through Colombia to the Darien Gap. And the second video is called, I think it's called This Now. I think it had a different name before. But anyway, it's right now he changed the name, or maybe this always was the name and I didn't remember it, but it's called I Was Trafficked Through the World's Deadliest Jungle. So as I said, he wants to do the same journey as the migrants. And in Venezuela, they're called the caminantes because they are walking. They have to walk through the Darien Gap and then do a lot of walking to get to the border with the U.S. and then walk across the border. So they're called walkers, which I find kind of interesting because in The Walking Dead, of course, the zombies, they call them walkers. But in Spanish, it's a caminante, or, in plural, caminantes. So there is this idea that there is a migration of caminantes from Venezuela through the Darien Gap. And Bald, as he says in his videos, he wanted to become a caminante, join the migration, and then go with the caminantes, living and traveling just as they do, and film the experience. And that's what he's doing. He's actually doing it. And as he said, in order to reproduce the life of a caminante, he does not want to, use money as a crutch. Obviously, he has tons of money, so it's not like he's poor. He's not limited in his options. But what he said is he brought $1,000 with him. So he has $1,000 and then a small bag on his back, and that's it. And then he's going to try to recreate, he's going to join the migrant path, the caminantes. He wants to become a caminante himself. So that's the basic idea, and he's doing it with another YouTuber. I'd never heard of this guy. I know a lot about him now because I sort of did a deep dive, call it a shallow dive. I did a shallow dive into his life and his channel, and his name is Timmy Carter. He's from Greece, and he seems like a good fit for Bald because, Bald has a certain style about him. He's a little bit of what I would call a stunt YouTuber. He always wants to go someplace that is sort of sensational or crazy or wild, and whether he actually does it or not, whether the situation really lives up to how he describes it, that's the names of his videos are always like that. You see it all over YouTube now. There's so many stunt YouTubers. There's so many superlatives in their titles. I survived, the most dangerous slum of Manila. Everybody's always going to the slums, hanging out with the gangs, drug cartels. It's always something crazy and insane and wild and dangerous. And Timmy Carter, he falls right into that group. I mean, I was looking at his channel, and if you just go over his the names of his videos, you quickly get a sense of who this guy is. Tons and tons of things like the dark side of Cuba that the media is hiding from you. Inside the world's most miserable country, traveling in Cuba is a pure struggle. Captured by Cuban girls in Havana. And that's really a big theme of his channel. It's like 50% of his video thumbnails are of him with young, attractive women in bikinis, and a lot of them are prostitutes. They're working girls. So he's got, captured by Cuban girls, lost in Havana's dodgy streets, and the thumbnail is of him with a, young, half-dressed woman beside him. The next one, How I Met Your Mother. He's on a beach with another girl in a bathing suit. How I Met Your Mother in Colombia, Part 2. He's on another beach with another young girl in a bikini. Brazilian rappers took me to their favela hood. So he's hanging out with, rappers in a dangerous favela. Surviving an illegal party in Rio's most notorious favelas. If you love kisses, visit this country. And there's a series of like 3 video thumbnails in a row of him kissing a young girl in a bikini. I mean, it just goes on and on. Colombian adventure made me wet. And now he's in a bus with another woman. It's just, that's basically what he's all about. And so it seems like he's a perfect fit for Bald and Bankrupt, because Bald has the same sort of atmosphere about him and his activities. And when the two of them link up in these videos, like Bald, he's posting his videos on his channel, and Timmy Carter is posting his videos of the same experience on his channel. So we're going to get to see it from 2 different points of view. But they're very, very similar, because I think they're even sharing video clips back and forth, partially because they're traveling very light. And I kind of love this aspect of their journey with my interest in camera gear and technology. I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with this camera called the Sony FDR X3000. Came out in 2016 from a Sony vlogging camera. And a lot of people, including Casey from Camera Conspiracies, they will argue that it is still, like 2016 it was released, it was never updated, Sony never released another one, and people will argue today that it is still in many ways the best vlogging camera you can buy. Like nothing that has been made since then trumps the X3000 that was made in 2016. And it is so special for 2 reasons. It has optical stabilization. So it has a form factor like a camcorder. It's not, it's not shaped like a GoPro, this rectangular brick. It's actually a camera that is held sideways like a camcorder, which is actually more natural in terms of taking video. The camcorder ergonomics are better than this, to be honest. So it has that camcorder shape, and because the lens is the lens then can be very, very long, and it has optical stabilization built into it that is almost as good as the best GoPro digital stabilization. And it is not waterproof, so the microphones don't have a waterproof membrane over the top. So it has excellent stabilization, excellent ergonomics, and excellent audio. You don't really need an external microphone for it. It just has built-in mics that sound really, really good all the way back in 2016. The problem with the camera, for me, is that it has no screens. There's no screens at all, and there's no, like the GoPro, the action cameras from DJI, they all have a touch screen, so you can see the video that you're recording, you can review the video that you're recording and make sure you got what you wanted, and you can go into the menu system and change all the settings on the touchscreen. And the Sony has no screens at all, just a tiny, like a text-based LCD, And then in order to change the settings, you actually have to use this really complicated series of button pushes to open up a menu. Then you got to click 3 times and scroll down with this button, select with this button, change options with this button, now save your changes with this button. It's really complicated. And then even then, you never know whether you're really recording video or not, because you can't play it back, you can't see it on the screen. And it was a relatively expensive camera for its day. So I think because of all those reasons, like back when I bought my first GoPro, it was a GoPro Hero 7, I think at that time I was also looking at the Sony X3000, like which one should I buy? And I think, I can't really remember my thoughts anymore, it was so long ago, but I think I bought the GoPro Hero 7 because of the screen. It just seemed like a huge advantage, and I didn't buy the X3000. But ever since then, I've constantly wondered whether the X3000 would have been a better choice, mainly because of audio. Audio is always such a problem. And then Bald and Bankrupt, as far as I can tell, for 90% of his YouTube life, he has only used the X3000. He's not bothered with, he doesn't have to get, the Pocket 3 because of its 1-inch sensor, low light capabilities, tracking, He's like, forget all that. And I think he's very wise to have done this. He's like, I can't be bothered with any of that crap. I'm just telling a story, a simple story. All I need is to record what's happening easily and simply in a small, lightweight camera. And he's never purchased, it would never even occur to him to buy like an Olympus Micro Four Thirds camera because you get better image quality, or to buy a GoPro because you get better image quality and you can do all fancy time lapses and time warps. And he doesn't do any of that. He just grabs his little X3000 and is like, And I think that's a very wise choice. And he always travels very light. He doesn't carry any gear with him at all. I don't know if he ever carries any clothing, because every single video clip he seems to have a new shirt on, and I think he just wears a shirt until it's stinky, and then whatever market he's in, he just buys another shirt, puts it on, throws away the other one. I'm guessing, because I never see the same shirt again. He just wears a shirt and then he suddenly is wearing a different shirt, and his bag is so small, there's no way he's carrying, 5 changes of clothing. I think he just buys new clothes whenever he needs it, right? And I admire all of that, and I often think, that's how I should have gone, back when I started my YouTube life. It feels like that was a branching point. Here it was, I wanted to start shooting video, and I chose a GoPro Hero 7, and then I chose a Panasonic G85. Those are my 2 cameras, and that led me into so much trouble, so many problems, constantly looking for a microphone, an attachment, an adapter, plugging it in. This doesn't work. All this time, all this energy, and meanwhile Bald and Bankrupt is out there with his X3000, probably the same one that he bought in 2016. And you look at these videos of his migrant journey. Of course, I'm doing deep dives. I'm taking screenshots every time a camera appears, and then I'm blowing it up so I can see all the details. And he's got a piece of foam. He probably grabbed a piece of foam from an old mattress, and he's holding it over the microphone, the built-in mic with an elastic band. And I guess that's his windscreen, right? He's not going to go out and buy a windscreen and that's designed for that camera. He just takes a pair of scissors, cuts a piece of foam off a mattress, and wraps it onto the camera with an elastic band. And he is holding up on a little bit of a grip, like he's got a small tripod hand grip, but it looks like it's long been broken, and the whole top part is just like held in place with black electrical tape. He's just like wrapped a whole bunch of tape in there to hold it in place. And so that's all he has. And then it turns out that Timmy Carter, perhaps, emulating Bald and Bankrupt, he also uses an X3000. So I was so entertained when these 2 guys got together for their Caminantes expedition, they had dueling X3000s. So they're both filming with an X3000, and I think when it comes to their videos, if one of them doesn't have the clip that they want to tell their story, they're actually sharing clips back and forth. They're each posting separate videos that tell a different story from their point of view. But I've watched all of them, and I've noticed that in Bald's video, there's clips that were clearly shot by Timmy. And Timmy is using clips that were shot by Bald. They're using the same cameras, so of course the video files are perfectly compatible with each other, and they would look the same too. Though, to be honest, I don't think they're really worried about that. They're not exactly the type of YouTubers to be concerned that, you know, the color science of one video clip matches the color science of the other. And they're not concerned at all about audio, because throughout Bald's videos, I mean, the audio sometimes is just terrible. It breaks down all the time. You hear it in one ear but not the other, and yeah, there's a lot of audio problems, a lot of technical problems, but none of that matters, because you see the scene and you hear what people are saying, and that's all you need. So yeah, I kind of I have this ongoing struggle with that, because I feel a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe embarrassed is too strong a word, perhaps, but I feel a little bit, yeah, let's say not embarrassed. I can't think of the word, but like in my experience, I'm more interested in camera gear, and I'll be watching a YouTube video, then I'm looking at the image quality, you know, some very professional YouTuber, and their video is just like, wow, it looks amazing. It looks so beautiful, and I get interested in that. I want to have video that looks that good. So I end up going down the rabbit hole of trying to find some kind of a camera that I can use that's in my budget, you know, that works, that has stabilization, and, you know, the endless search for the perfect vlogging camera that can give me great audio, great, you know, video quality, and great stabilization, and is light enough to hold in your hand. You know, I've just been obsessing about this for 5 years, and then meanwhile, you know, Bald and Bankrupt probably hasn't spent 2 minutes worrying about it. He bought his X3000. Oh, I'm done. I'm just going to film. And who cares what the video looks like? Who cares what it sounds like? If you can see what I'm looking at, you can hear what I'm saying, that's all I care about. And, you know, he's right, obviously, because, you know, his 2 videos so far from the Darien Gap has like 1.5 million views each. And he's one of the most popular YouTubers on the planet, and he's very entertaining in his storytelling. So yeah, you can't argue with the results, though I am attracted towards better quality video and better audio and things like that. But then you can go a little bit crazy in that direction. But I do find, a little bit of a tangent here, that sometimes this jealousy is misplaced. Like, I end up feeling weird about something I'm doing because I see somebody else doing it better. Like, for example, I often have a lot of gear with me. I will have a big, heavy backpack for multiple reasons. And I see someone like Bald who has like nothing in his bag. Like, he has a small bag. It looks like there's nothing in it. There's no weight to it at all. And then I feel weird about, like, why do I have such a big, heavy bag? Like, why don't I have a small bag like him? But then, yeah, and then you end up feeling kind of inadequate by comparison. But then when you start doing a deep dive, you know, you realize, you know, there's reasons for that, where there can be, you know, financial reasons, where a really popular YouTuber doesn't have to carry everything with him because he can just buy whatever he wants along the way. That often happens. Plus, I think they organize things in the background, but they don't tell you about what they're doing. So, for example, Bald and Bankrupt, there's no way he has a laptop with him. There's no way. So, how in the world is he editing and posting videos of this journey? So all of that logistics is built into what he's doing. He does have a laptop. He does have this. He does have that. He does have all these things. He just never shows them, and they're never in his bag. And I don't know how he does it. I'd love to know how he did it. Like, how did he get through this journey through the Darien Gap, record all this video, save all the video? Like, how did he manage to save it all? How did he charge his batteries? Like there was no power in the jungle. So how did he make it through the jungle without charging? Like, I don't know. And I have this idea that he planned ahead, and then he probably shipped a laptop and everything he would need to, I don't know, Mexico City or Panama City, and he had all that waiting for him there. And then he would just have to have a light bag for 5 days to get to the next town. And then there he has his laptop, and he can do all his editing and uploading. And then he leaves. So instead of bringing all his gear with him, he somehow has access to it along the way. I wish I knew. I don't know how he does it. But it often turns out, when I see someone traveling in a streamlined way with a light bag, it turns out it's a bit of an illusion that they do have all the gear that I also have. They're just not carrying it with them at that time. And they're very careful not to show any of this stuff going on in the background. So my sense of feeling inadequate is sometimes misplaced. Yeah, who knows? So that's just a bit of a tangent there. I just wanted to talk about the overall nature of his journey, what Bald was trying to do. So he's, as I said, recreating the life of a caminante, and a migrant trying to enter the United States. The end goal is to get into the US, whether legally or illegally, when they get to the border. And he wants to film it along the way, and he's using a Sony X3000, and he's traveling with Timmy Carter, a young guy from Greece who also has an X3000, though Timmy has two cameras. I noticed he has the Sony X3000 and he has a GoPro Hero 11, I believe. It's either a 10 or 11. I noticed that in one of the videos. And I saw a couple of clips from Bald Bankrupt where he was clearly not looking at the lens of the camera, so he wasn't using the X3000. I'm guessing that he was using, he probably had a smartphone with him, though he never shows the smartphone, but he must have shot some of the clips with a smartphone, because you could see his eye line was like looking away from the camera. He was looking at himself on the screen rather than at the lens. So that tells me there's no way it was an X3000. So he was probably using a smartphone, or he had another camera with him. I'm not sure. So, and he started with $1,000 and a small bag. I was really amused. It was somewhere on Reddit or on a YouTube comment, someone was joking that he was trying to live the life of a poor Venezuelan economic refugee, but his backpack was a Louis Vuitton or something, or Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and they tracked it down and said that bag was worth $3,000, right? So I thought that was kind of amusing. So I've watched both videos from Bald and Bankrupt that he's posted so far, and I've watched the one video from Timmy Carter, and I have to say that there are, for me, there are quite a few issues. I have quite a few issues with his video, and I've made a list of my issues here on my laptop, and I'm just going to go through the list and talk about them one by one, and that will lead me into talking about the illegal migrants heading to the United States. It's kind of a tough thing to talk about because even the vocabulary gets confusing. You want to call them migrants, and that is accurate because a migrant is someone who is traveling for work. They're traveling somewhere else to, perhaps better their lives and find work. So they really are migrants. But then a lot of people who are against, They're anti-refugees, anti-immigration, anti-illegal immigration. They get upset with that word, like, oh, they're not migrants, they're illegal aliens. Because when they get to the United States, you know, the vast majority of them are going to cross the border illegally. They have no other choice because they don't have the proper documentation. They don't have money to do it legally. So they are illegal immigrants. But they are also migrants. So sometimes when you're talking about them, you're not quite sure what to call them. And Bald has kind of an elegant solution to that because he just generally calls them caminantes. They are all caminantes, which means basically that they are walking from their home country to try to get to the United States in whatever way they can. So they are caminantes. Maybe I'll end up using caminantes all the way through here, though most other people, like websites and things, they call them migrants. And that's, you know, maybe I'll call them migrants or caminantes, you know, one or the other. Calling them like illegal immigrants, just too many syllables. And it's a more complex issue than just sort of calling everybody an illegal immigrant. That doesn't really do justice to their situation, or it's not a very nuanced term. Migrant and caminante is a little bit more nuanced, allows for a lot more variety and interpretation in terms of what's going on. The first issue that I had with his videos and the whole approach is the obvious one. It's basically, is this sensationalism? And you see that a lot on YouTube. And I mean, I can come at the topic from many different points of view. It's a little bit like taking the lives of these caminantes who are in very serious situations, driven out of their countries because of the threat of violence or poverty, trying to make a new life for their children, for their family. They try, you know, Venezuela's economy has just collapsed. It's almost impossible for people to get by day to day and to even contemplate a future for their children. So, you know, they set off on this very dangerous journey, and they run into some very harrowing situations. If you go on to the more legitimate, you know, Human Rights Watch, for example, go to their website, you look at other stories from, you know, legitimate media sources, people do get killed. A lot of the women get raped along the way. People die. They get robbed. They get extorted. They live through some very horrible experiences. Not all of them. I think a lot of those dangers are a little bit also overblown and sensationalized in all media, but there's no question that, you know, things are difficult for these people. And then when you make a YouTube video about it, are you using their lives just for fun? Like, you're just taking their lives and turning it into entertainment on YouTube? And I think that's a serious question. You see a lot of what they call poverty tourism, because YouTube travelers want to show something that is more extreme. So they will go to the slums of Manila. You know, every time they go to a major city of the world that has slums, you know, they'll go there and shoot a video there, and they want to show the extremes of poverty. And they can couch it with all the language they want of, you know, I'm trying to expose this to the world and help these people through telling their stories. But in the end, it's really entertainment. You're using the lives of these people to make an entertaining video for YouTube, you know. And from that point of view, yeah, you can call it poverty tourism. And yeah, you can level that criticism at a lot of the things, you know, that Bald and Bankrupt does, and Timmy Carter does, things like that. And at the beginning of his videos, Bald does say the right things as he's setting up the story of what it is he's doing. He does say that he wants to, you know, he talks about the dangers that people face and the difficulties. He does say several times that these people are leaving their countries for legitimate reasons, that they're fleeing from terrible situations. And he says that he wants to take this journey to tell the stories of the people that he meets along the way. So he does use the right language at the beginning, but then he never actually does it. he doesn't actually tell the stories of the people he meets along the way, and he gets so many things wrong. He doesn't really even understand the factors that are driving this sort of migration. He says a lot of things that are incorrect. So he talks a good game at the beginning, but then he doesn't really follow through. The video is all about him, about the dangers that he's going to be facing. And he's sort of pandering to an audience on YouTube that wants to admire this kind of wild and crazy adventurism. And it's all about sensationalism. It's about ego and, you know, about greed to an extent, wanting to profit from, you know, the misery of these people. So you can criticize it from that point of view, whether you want to go that far with it or not. Because, yeah, again, I think in the world of media, there's room for everything. You know, there are people out there, you know, serious journalists doing hardcore, you know, research and documentaries about this migration. So that is out there. So maybe there is room for, you know, a fun, goofy guy like Bald, you know, going along with them and then documenting it from his point of view. You know, so that maybe there's room for it as well. But it's just an issue that pops up in my mind, even when I see the video titles, you know, all about the dangers that he's going to be facing. And that becomes more clear when you contrast it with the other stories that are out there. So I mentioned the 5-part documentary from CNN. Well, you know, in his videos, Bald did say a few times, you know, he's the first person to, you know, go with the migrants on this journey and document, but he isn't really. Lots of people have done it. It's a huge story worldwide, and a lot of film crews have documented the journeys of these migrants in various ways. And the most recent one that I watched was this, you know, 5-part series from CNN, where a journalist did the exact same thing that Bald did. He actually, you know, boots on the ground. He went with a group of migrants across the Darien Gap, and he had I don't know exactly how he filmed it. He clearly had at least one person with him, a cameraman who was doing the filming for him. So there were 2 of them at least, and I'm sure he did everything legally. You know, he had to get permits and licenses, and he probably had security with him as well, because CNN's insurance company is not going to allow anyone on their payroll to do what Bald did. You know, so this CNN reporter had to meet insurance requirements. So I'm sure he had security with him, things like that. They don't show any of that in the video. So it is a bit of a different experience from what Bald did. Bald is much more on the gonzo, wild and crazy side of things, and perhaps much more risky for him than for the CNN correspondent to do it. But on the other side, the CNN correspondent actually, he had his facts straight. He was telling the story accurately, and he was really telling the story of the other people with him. It wasn't an ego-driven story about him and all the difficulties he endured. It was about the people around him. He really was there to document the lives of the caminantes. Bald said that's what he was doing, but the way things worked out, he didn't really do that, because that's not entertaining. That's not going to get 1.5 million views on YouTube, and he knows that. And I was thinking I could give him credit, though, because even when he is on the journey, even if he wanted to document the lives of the people around him, there are 2 reasons he couldn't do that. One is just a matter of personal security. As he talked about a lot of times, he clearly looks different from everyone around him. He looks like a Westerner, and there was this idea that a lot of people told him this over and over again, that he should make sure he don't speak English. Like, don't tell people you're from the UK, because that will make you a target for the gangs, and they will kidnap you for ransom, or they will rob you because they will think you are richer and you have cameras. They'll want to steal your cameras. So he had this idea that he had to hide his identity, hide what he was doing, and pretend to be a Russian because he speaks Russian. And if he says he's a Russian refugee, well, that makes sense, but there's no way anyone's going to believe that he's a refugee from the UK. They had to pretend to be other people. Plus, there you are with 100 people from all around the world, and they are all trying to enter the United States illegally. So do you want to put their faces on video? I know if I were doing that and I were there with my GoPros, I would be reluctant. I would want to tell their stories because that's what I'm there to do, perhaps. But then I don't want to. I would feel uncomfortable going up to these people, putting my camera in their face and say, oh, so you're from Venezuela, and why are you leaving Venezuela? And get their story about all the hardships they endured, but now you're putting them on YouTube. Here are these people who are illegal, and they're trying to get into the United States illegally. And do they want to be on camera that way? You know, they're trying to do things secretly. So I could see Bald wanting to tell the stories of these people, but in reality, once he was there, he found it wasn't quite as easy to do. And maybe that's why he didn't really tell their stories in the way that he said he was going to. So I can cut him some slack from that point of view. And just for context, because Bald, he doesn't really give much context, and the context he does give isn't actually accurate, and he doesn't give much information. The one thing he said is that the driving force behind all these migrants going through the Darien Gap is that it's cheap. That the reason all these people are on foot and hiking through the Darien Gap, you know, going through the jungle, the reason they're doing that is because it's the cheapest way. And it turns out that that is actually not true at all. And there's a real history to that. And just to get that context and that history, I made some notes from this HRW website. As I said, they posted a big article called How the Treacherous Darien Gap Became a Migration Crossroads of the Americas. And they give all the information that Bald doesn't give. So I find it to be interesting context. So, for example, up until 2021, there were very few migrants crossing the Darien Gap. This is the huge migration that's going on right now, it's relatively new. Most people think it's been going on forever, and there's always been people going across the Darien Gap, but for a long time, they tended to be Colombians who were fleeing from the cartels. You know, their villages would be burned to the ground by the drug cartels, and they're fleeing Colombia, and they have no choice. They try to go north, and they hike through the Darien Gap, you know, to get to Panama and then onward from there. But very, very few people were doing that. And Panama didn't start keeping track until 2010. That's when they started to control the flow of people and keep track of it. So based on their research, from 2010 to 2014, about 2,400 people went through the Darien Gap per year. So when they came out on the Panama side, they would have like a camp there, and all the authorities would be there, and they would process the people, and they kept track of them starting in 2010. And for the first 5 years, about 2,500 people made that journey every year. And then in 2015 to 2016, it jumped to 30,000 per year. And then after that, it started like doubling every year. So in 2021, that's when it became a story. So as of 2021, huge numbers were going through the Darien Gap on foot. And this was a relatively new thing. So in 2021, there was 130,000 people. In 2022, last year, 250,000 people were documented, recorded, going through the Darien Gap. 250,000 people made that trek through the Darien Gap. 250,000. And now, 2023, by the end of 2023, 500,000 people will have gone through the Darien Gap. So 500,000 people made that hike through the Darien Gap jungle the same journey that Bald did. So we're talking about over 2,500 people every day. So I think that's very different from people's imagination. Like, you think of someone like an illegal immigrant going through the Darien Gap jungle. You think of some guy on his own, with a backpack and survival gear and hiking through the jungle for weeks or something. And then, machete carving his way through the jungle all by himself. That's what you picture. But in fact, it's much more organized than you imagine. And when you see the CNN documentary and watch Bald's video, you realize that it's actually much more organized than you would think. And that's because, 2,500 people make that journey every single day. Like, every day, a new group of 2,500 people start the trek through the jungle. Then the next day, 2,500. So can you imagine how many people are on those jungle trails and then arriving in Panama every single day? 2,500 new people. So it's a much, much bigger and much more organized operation than I realized, than most people realized. And the composition of the people has changed dramatically. Where the numbers I was looking for, that from like 2015 to 2021, 89% of the migrants came from either Haiti or Cuba. And that makes sense. Like, Haiti has been in trouble for the last decade. So most of these migrants were from Haiti or Cuba. And yet now, the vast majority of them are from Venezuela. And the reason for that is quite interesting. Again, Bald said that all these Venezuelans are hiking through the Darien Gap, because of the economic crisis in Venezuela, which is true, but they're doing it because that's the cheapest way to go to the United States. But it turns out that that's not true at all, because Venezuelans have been fleeing from Venezuela for a very long time, for many, many years, but they were flying. They were flying from Venezuela to Mexico, and then from Mexico, they try to get into the United States. But with all the pressures in the United States against this illegal immigration, they put pressure on countries like Mexico to change their policies. So what actually happened, the reason Venezuelans are now going through the Darien Gap on foot, is because Mexico changed the policy in 2022, and they stopped issuing visas to Venezuelans. So in 2022, Venezuelans could no longer fly to Mexico because they couldn't get a visa for Mexico. No visas for Venezuelans. So then all these Venezuelans who were fleeing, they couldn't fly to Mexico anymore, so they had no choice but to walk through the Darien Gap. They wanted to go overland to the United States because they couldn't fly to Mexico anymore. They had to go overland to Mexico, and the first part of that journey, unfortunately for them, there are no roads, the Darien Gap. And that's why there are, 2,500 people per day, 500,000 people per year walking through the Darien Gap. It's because of the change in visa policies, that they can no longer go to Mexico, go to all these other Central American countries on a tourist visa, because all those countries stopped issuing visas to people from all these countries, which I find absolutely fascinating. And this ties in with what I was talking about at the very beginning about the thesis of the Radiolab podcast, that deterrents don't work, and that when you put in place a deterrent, it doesn't stop migration. All it does is push migration into a more dangerous route. And we see that here as well, where they had all these migrants flying into Mexico, and the US and Mexico wanted to stop that, so they refused to give them tourist visas. But that didn't stop the migration. All it did was force the migration to find another route, and now they're going overland through the jungle of the Darien Gap, which I find really quite interesting. And it turns out that this migrant population going through the Darien Gap is not just from South America. They actually consist of people from all around the world. A lot of people from China now. That group is growing and growing and growing. People from Africa, people from Afghanistan, people from a lot of countries around the world are also hiking through the Darien Gap, and they're doing this also because of visa policy changes. They used to fly into Mexico on a tourist visa, and then of course they just become illegal. They overstay their tourist visa in Mexico, try to get work in Mexico, try to live there, try to get work or live in countries in Central America, and if that doesn't work out, then they migrate up towards the United States. And when they could no longer get visas there, they had to go to countries where it was easier to get visas. So now they're flying into places like Chile and Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, any country in South America where they can get a tourist visa. They fly into that country, and then from that country they start walking to the north or traveling by bus if they have enough money to travel to Colombia and then get over to the Darien Gap and then keep walking all the way up to the United States. So you have that side of it as well. And Venezuelans are doing that as well. So Venezuelans, some of them are going directly into Colombia and then into the Darien Gap to Panama. Others, they're trying to do it a different route. So they would go to Chile or Argentina because they heard from other people that in Chile, it's easier to get a visa to go to the United States, like to get into some kind of an immigration program that, if you're an economic refugee or political refugee, you can apply and you have a better chance of getting approved in Chile or Ecuador than in Colombia or Venezuela. So when they leave Venezuela, they go to those countries, they try that first, and if that doesn't work, they'll go to another country, and if that doesn't work, they may end up joining the caminantes as they walk through the jungle. So the whole experience, again, is much more nuanced and much more interesting than Bald talks about in his video. And another reason that the number of caminantes has increased so dramatically, I find this quite interesting, is that information was distributed. So like with everything in life, if there's something difficult to do, the first people that do it are the pioneers, and then they are either successful or not successful. And then once they figure out the system, they communicate with friends and family back home and give them all the information how to do it. So the very first people that went through the Darien Gap, and maybe they made it all the way to the United States, all the way to Canada, wherever they're trying to go. And then if they're successful, their friends and family want to know how to do it. And they would send information back. Okay, what you have to do is go to this town and then get across the border this way, then go to this town. Make sure you avoid this area because there's border patrols. Go this direction instead. Then you go here and you get a boat. They send all this information back, and then a new wave of people follow the pioneers. They learn these things and they send information back, and then over the years this flow gets more and more refined and people get more and more information, and then more and more people start to attempt the journey. And I think right now in 2023 they've reached a crisis point of as I said, 500,000 people making this journey through the Darien Gap, and a lot of these people aren't prepared for it. Like the pioneers, the first people who did it tended to be young males, in good physical condition. They have no family, no responsibilities, and they could handle the journey, and then they would give information back. But now we've gotten to the point where there's just enough organization and a lot of misinformation that now we have everybody doing it. So you have like entire families. Even in Bald's video, you'll see entire families, like African families, where you've got a father and a mother, and each one of them has a baby, in a chest harness, you know, so they're each carrying a baby, and they'll have another child, like a toddler. And this family, you know, husband, wife, 3 children, 2 of whom they have to carry, are hiking through one of the most brutal jungles in the world. And you can tell from the way they're dressed, from their footwear, from their lack of preparation, that they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. The guides, the smugglers, the human smugglers, they make money from all these people making the journey, so they want to encourage them to go. They want as many people to do it as possible, and they will underplay how difficult it is and how long it will take. So they will tell, you know, a mother will come up to one of these guides carrying 2 children, and will say, you know, it's like, is it possible? Like, can I make this trip? And they'll say, oh, it's easy, no problem. You just walk, and it only takes 2 days, no problem. You know, that's what they will tell them. And then, of course, when they start the journey, they realize it's going to take a lot longer than that, and it's so difficult physically that, you know, to go in there with your grandmother and your 2 babies and a toddler wearing street shoes is absolutely insane. I mean, it's ridiculous to even try to do it, but that's what's going on right now, and that's the scene, you know, that Bald joined. And you end up, it's so organized that you end up going through a series of camps, big camps that have developed, and they're like run by the local gangs or smugglers or just people who say they're trying to help, but they're charging money for people to stay there, charging money for food and water and things like that. But there will be, you know, hundreds of people in these camps, and they get organized in groups with a guide, and they even have porters. There's even people making a living as a porter along this trail now, and they will offer to carry your children or to carry food and water for you, but you have to pay them to do this. And then a group of like 100 of them, 200 of them will set off together. And then that's what Bald joined. You know, he joined one of these huge groups, and then they went off all together. And for just a bit more context, I haven't even started talking about Bald and Bankrupt yet, but I find this story really fascinating. And I've been doing all of this research, and I thought I'd share it with you a little bit. And what I'm going to do now, if this will work out, I'm going to call up Google Maps on my laptop, and I'm going to record my screen here, and I'll keep talking while I record what I'm doing here, and I can show you some of the things that I'm talking about. So here is Google Maps, and there is South America, of course, down there. Central America right there, and then Mexico, United States. And what Bald is doing, he started in Venezuela, and his plan was to, you know, recreate the journey of a Venezuelan caminante. And what they would do is go overland into Colombia, and then he went to the city of Medellin, and then from Medellin you travel to the north, so northern Colombia, until you get here, and this is the Darien Gap. So this is Panama right here. I'll zoom in a little bit. So here's Medellin, and then he traveled up here to this area, and then this is where the Darien Gap is. There's the border between Panama and Colombia, and the Darien Gap is on both sides of the border. And then you cross the Darien Gap, and then Bald intends to travel, you know, all the way through Central America, all these countries, into Mexico, and then, of course, eventually end up somewhere on the border where he can find a border fence, and then he will touch the border fence. So the way things are organized now, it's quite interesting. And then I think a lot of people assume that the Darien Gap crossing is like a south to north journey, because this is where the Darien Gap is, this big area here. You can see there's no roads. That yellow line is a road going through Panama, and then the road stops there. And there's no roads at all down here. So I think most people assume that the journey across the Darien Gap starts here. You leave the road, and then you go north through the jungle to the, this road, and then you start traveling by road again. But in fact, it doesn't work that way at all. The main migrant pathway for the caminantes actually starts here. You see this bay here. There's a small town here. Let's zoom in, get this clearer. So in fact, the journey of the caminantes starts here, and that's where Bald went. Nekokli. I don't know the name of it. That's where all the migrants begin their journey across this bay. What is it called? All right. Brazzo, Leon, Rio, Atrato. But anyway, so there's this bay here, and they get on a boat in Nekokli, and then they can go to one of two places. Either here, which is the city of Akandi, so boats go back and forth between Nekokli and Akandi, or they can go from Nekokli to this town to the north, which is Caporgana. So this is still Colombia. So there's the border. So all the migrants travel to Nekokli, and then they go either to here, Akandi, or to here, and then they walk west. So here, people who arrive in Akandi, they go through the jungle overland in this direction, and this is the jungle, the Darien Gap, and they walk to this place, Bajo Chiquito. And this is in Colombia, this is in Panama now, and Bajo Chiquito is like a refugee processing center. So there are big camps here. So the goal for all the caminantes is to reach this place, and they get there by boat. So in fact, they walk through the jungle, and finally around here, they get to a river, because here you can see there are hills. This is all hills and jungle, and then they come down out of the hills, and then they get to a river. Let's see if the river will show up. So there are a couple of rivers there. Yeah, not very clear. But once they get to the rivers, there are a system of boats, and the boats take them down river to this processing center. And there they register with Panama, the authorities, and they end up in kind of a refugee camp there, a transit camp. If they happen to go, instead of to Akandi, they go to this town, Caporgana, then they cross the border here, go through the jungle, through the hills, until they get to another river, and then they go down the river to this place, which is Membrillo, Canaan, Membrillo, and this is another government processing center for migrants. So those are the choices you have, and there's one more choice. If you have more money, if you're richer, and you can pay for it, instead of doing the walk, you go by boat. So you would go from Nekokli to here, to Caporgana, but then you would hire another boat, and then this boat would take you up the coast to Careto or one of these towns. So you can go by boat to one of these towns, and then you hike through the jungle, but it's a much, much shorter trip. So if you have money, according to what I saw online, it costs about $400 to go by boat from here to one of these towns, and then you pay again to be escorted, into Panama. So basically you've got a choice of 3 routes: Nekokli to Akandi, and from Akandi to Bajo Chiquito. So that's one route. Route number 2 is Nekokli to Caporgana, and then from Caporgana to Membrillo. And the third route is Nekokli to Caporgana, and then by boat up the coast. So that's basically the context. And I find it kind of interesting because, again, I think most people assume the Darien Gap goes south to north, and that all these people will be walking through this vast area of jungle and then finally arriving here, to Yaviza, and then getting on the road But in fact, the journey starts here in Nekokli, and you end up walking a much shorter distance than you imagine. Just this distance from this town to a river, and then you take a boat. And these boats are actually organized. They have, you pay to take them, $20 or $40 per person. They have life jackets, and they're sort of run by humanitarian organizations and by the Panamanian government, things like that. And I'm sure some of them are private, who knows. But yeah, everybody has matching life jackets, and you pay to buy a ticket to take the boat. So it's a lot more organized than you think. And I'll talk about that a lot more when I talk about what Bald did. Because what he ended up doing, which is kind of interesting, he went to Nekokli, and then he took the boat. Again, it's like a regular ferry boat. You buy a ticket for it because you're just traveling within Colombia. You're not, doing anything illegal at this point. You just go to the dock in Nekokli, find a boat, and then pay for a ticket, and you get your life jacket, and then you take the boat. And he took his boat to here, to Capargana, and then he found a smuggler there, a guide, and he paid for a boat ride to take him up the coast into Panama. He doesn't say where he went, like he does not tell where the boat went, but apparently he didn't make it. He tried to enter Panama this way, the easy way, basically, but he was turned back by the military. He was caught by the Panamanian military, and he was sent all the way back to Capargana, and then he tried again, and then he joined the migrant trail, walking over this jungle to this place. So that's what he did. Nekokli to here, then he tried to take a boat to here, got turned back, and then he walked from here to this migrant processing camp over there. So that's basically what Bald did. And this is the established migrant pathway right now. I just want to end this with one last thought that I'm still really confused about. And that is how organized all of this is, where there are so many migrants making this journey. As I said, it's gotten to like 500,000 people per year making this walk through the jungle. And there are so many government agencies and humanitarian groups and NGOs now, plus the cartels and the gangs operating in the Darien Gap. There's so much of that has gotten more and more organized, so that the way they describe the journey, so far when I read about all this on websites and watch all the news stories, all these migrants cross the border illegally into Panama, and then they arrive in the camp. But at this point, it's so organized, it kind of confuses me. Like, to take the boat, they have to pay $40 to get on the boat. They go to the camp, and at the camp, they stand in a lineup. It's like an immigration processing center, and they all get registered, and they say that they stay in the camp for just a few hours, some of them. And then if they have money, they pay $40 per person, and then they get put on a bus. And then the bus takes them to Costa Rica. So they travel all the way from these processing centers by bus for $40 through Panama, and the buses take them to Costa Rica. And then that's where the story ends. But for me, that begs so many questions. It's like, here at the processing centers, they know that every single person entered Panama without permission. A lot of them have no passports, they have no visas, they often have no money. They are all illegal immigrants in Panama. So it sort of feels like, well, just send them back. Like, it's not like they're sneaking through Panama. Everybody knows they are there. The authorities know they're there. The government knows they are there. The immigration authorities are, in fact, processing them, but instead of arresting them and saying, oh, you entered Panama illegally, and then sending them home, I guess that would be quite expensive to do. Maybe that's why they don't do it. But what they end up doing is they have an organized system where they pay $40 each, and then the bus takes them all the way to Costa Rica. But again, my question is, why does Costa Rica let them in? Again, if I were, there's the border with Costa Rica. If I were working at the immigration authorities in Costa Rica, it's like, well, every day dozens of buses are arriving at the border, and they're full of illegal migrants from all over the world. Why am I letting them into Costa Rica? Like I don't understand that. There's something going on here that I don't understand. They're all on official government immigration buses that are transporting them from the border. They crossed illegally, and then all these buses are bringing them to Costa Rica, and then Costa Rica is letting them into the country. But I don't know what happens to them here. Are they just dumped into Costa Rica, or do they stay in the buses, and the buses then bring them, all the way to the other border, and then the buses go to Nicaragua? And like, how do they get through all these countries of Central America until they finally get to Mexico? This whole system confuses me in the sense that it is so organized and seems to be so accepted, and it feels like all of these people could be stopped easily at each one of these borders, and yet there's a system, an official system, that just moves them along, knowing full well that they're all going to Mexico and that they're all going to try to enter the United States illegally. It's not like it's a big secret. Anyway, so I am confused about that. I understand all of this. This makes sense to me because here in Necoclí, you're in Colombia. Capargana and Acandi, they're both in Colombia. So there's no legal problem with anybody getting on a boat going from here to here. And then at this point, people just walk into the jungle and cross the border illegally into Panama. And it's all kind of logical. Okay, I understand all of that. But then I suddenly don't understand what happens after the processing center. Exactly how or why are they all being put on buses and then being driven all the way through Panama to Costa Rica? And I kind of understand why Panama would do it, because they want to get rid of these people. They don't want them in Panama, so they put them on buses and drive them all the way to Costa Rica and say, okay, these dozens of busloads of illegal immigrants, now they're your problem. That I understand, but why does Costa Rica let them in? And then what do they do with them once they enter Costa Rica? Anyway, the whole thing from that point on is confusing to me. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to Bald, because so far in his videos, as I said, he went from Necoclí to Capargana. He tried to go by boat, but he was turned back, and then he walked from Capargana to Membrillo. I'm pretty sure he was at Membrillo and the processing center, and that's where his video ends. And what happens to him after that, we don't know yet. So maybe he will answer some of my questions. I don't really know. We'll see whether they put him on a bus to Costa Rica, or because he's a British citizen, UK citizen, maybe they will just process him, give him a tourist stamp, and then just let him travel on his own through Panama. I don't know. So that'll be interesting to see what happens. Conclusion about all of this. One of my overall conclusions is what I've already talked about, being surprised at how many people are migrating through the Darien Gap right now. So we're talking about 500,000 people a year, counting from 2023. In 2022, the authorities of Panama processed and registered 250,000 people. And that's probably not all of them, because some of them would have gone past without being registered, right? So 250,000 is how many they know came through the Darien Gap. And in 2023, You know, they were just part way through 2023, and they already reached 250,000 and blew right past it. And by the end of this year, 500,000 people are going to go through the Darien Gap. And it's surprising to learn how many of them are Venezuelans. The vast majority are Venezuelan because of the visa policy change in Mexico, that they can no longer fly into Mexico, so now they have to walk. Also surprising how many people are coming from all around the world, and it's actually because of visa policies. They have to fly into a country in South America, any country that will let them in, and they try to pick a country that's as close to Colombia and Panama as possible, or hopefully even into Central America if they can do that. And then from there, they start the journey north, you know, to the United States. You know, people from China, a lot of them, people from Africa, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, I think, from Russia. So the whole variety of people doing that. It is also surprising. And I'm very curious about what happens after Panama. Because as I said, all of the research I've done, all the reading I've done, all the videos I've watched, they all stop in Panama because they're focusing on the Darien Gap. And then they say, okay, all these people who come out of the Darien Gap, now they pay $40, they get on a bus, and the bus takes them to Costa Rica. And that's where the story ends. And again, I'm like, really? Like, why do they put them on those buses? Why is Costa Rica letting them into their country? And if they are letting them in what fashion? Is it an official thing, or do they just get dumped in the country? And so after the Darien Gap, after Panama, I have no idea how these people continue their journey to the north. And this ties in with a lot of things I'm confused about illegal immigrants, again, coming from my own life as a largely legal immigrant. In the Radiolab podcast, there was an interview with a man from Ecuador, and they interviewed him because his sister had tried to come from Ecuador overland through the Darien Gap into Mexico, and she died in the desert. So she made that whole journey. She had all kinds of troubles, the usual ones in the Darien Gap. I can't remember if she was robbed or not, but I think she was. A lot of terrible things happened to her. She finally made it to the US border, had to go through the desert because the easier crossings were now closed by the United States. They couldn't get across there, and then she died in the desert at the end of her journey. But her brother had made that journey before she did. And two things about his journey. The first is that he made it. He made it all the way to New York City. And when they interviewed him, he's living in New York, has a job in New York, and he's sending money back home to his family in Ecuador. And this really confuses me because I don't know how that's possible. He doesn't speak English. He's not in the country legally. And yet he's living and working in New York. And if you take me right now, I was joking about this with a friend of mine, if you pick me up here and fly me to New York and drop me into the middle of Times Square, I couldn't survive. I'd end up dying there because I can't afford rent in New York. You know, even with my own life, I can't pay $3,000 a month for an apartment in New York. How am I going to find a job there that can possibly cover New York living expenses and rent? I couldn't do it. And I'm from Canada and I speak English perfectly. How is this illegal immigrant from Ecuador landing in New York, finding a place to live and a job that pays well enough to cover his living expenses and allow him to send money home? I don't understand this at all, and yet so many people do it all the time. So anyway, there's a real mystery there. There's something I'm not understanding. And the interview with this man was interesting also because he described his journey. So he also traveled overland. He was a caminante from Ecuador, and he went through the Darien Gap, you know, into Mexico. And along the way, he had horrific experiences. So a lot of the terrible things that you hear about happened to him directly. So in fact, I mean, he was a guy, he was a young teenage, a teenage boy, and he was robbed, and then he was raped by several men along the way, like the men that were guiding them along the trail, the people that they paid to guide them to the United States. They would expect as payment, sex with the women, and if not, they would rape them. And then in this case, they just took the boy into a house and they just raped him repeatedly. So that was part of his experience. And then when his sister was in Ecuador asking him for information, like, I want to come to the United States too, can you tell me, how to do it? Give me advice. And his advice was don't, do not do it. So his advice to everyone in Ecuador was don't do it. It's too dangerous. It's too difficult. It's not worth it. Just stay where you are. She refused to listen to him, and she went off on the journey by himself. And then she ended up dead in the desert in the United States. She didn't make it. So I guess I'm mentioning that story because that's just one of many, many stories that I came across reading about the Caminantes and the migration path, to the United States. The horrific things that these people do end up enduring. And then that leads me back to my opening ideas about, you take a video like Bald's video and Timmy Carter's video. I understand it, but there is this question of, should you be making an entertaining YouTube video profiting off the lives of people like that? You're taking an experience that's very real for these people. It's not a joke for them. They're leaving from horrific conditions where they can barely survive because of the economic collapse and the political uncertainty in places like Ecuador and Venezuela. They're fleeing from very terrible things. They feel like they have no choice but to embark on this journey, and they endure lots of horrific things along the way. And they don't have a safety net of any kind in terms of money or paperwork or passport or anything at all. To take all of that and then make a video about you going with them and turning it into a bit of a joke, turning their lives into entertainment for your YouTube audience. And I know Bald wasn't exactly doing that. He even talked about how he wanted to, tell the stories of the Caminantes, and yet he never really did that. And there were many, many points. The 2 nights that he spent in the jungle, there's like a big camp. All the Caminantes were sitting in a big group, and they're resting at the side of the river, and he's filming with his camera. And then he would turn to the group, and then he would shout something like, let's go to the United States, vamos a los Estados Unidos. And then all the people would cheer and raise their fist in the air. It's like, yes, let's go to the United States. It's a little bit of a perhaps overly lighthearted treatment of a very serious situation. But I guess that is a matter of taste, I suppose, a matter of opinion. As I said also, there is room in the world for everything. Not everybody has to be serious and grim and shoot a documentary about the evils of the world. There's enough people doing that. The market is filled with that. So if you have somebody like Bald who makes a more entertaining video about the same thing, I still think it's okay. There's room for that. If you want to watch a serious, gritty documentary about how difficult it is for migrants, it's all over YouTube, it's all over the media. You can see that story everywhere. So there is room in the world, and there's room in my brain for a video like Bald and Bankrupt's and Timmy Carter's, where they're doing it as kind of a YouTube stunt. They're just a bunch of fun-loving YouTubers who embarked on, you know, a fairly difficult experience, and then took video along the way. And yeah, I think there is room for it. But as I said, there are things to think about, and I did have some issues with the video overall. So I'm looking forward to the rest of his videos though. And Timmy Carter, he only posted one video so far. And I haven't really talked about his video because it's a mirror image of Bald's video. It tells pretty much the exact same story. So I didn't really go into the details about everything, you know, that he talked about and that he showed in his video, because he pretty much is showing the same thing. And I don't think he's shown his video from the Darien Gap itself yet. He's only posted a video about traveling through Colombia to get to the beginning of the Darien Gap. I haven't seen his Darien Gap video yet, and I'm looking forward to watching that. And that is it for behind the scenes today. My coffee cup is empty, so it's time to make another cup of coffee and get on with the rest of my day. All right, shutting down, and I'll see you in the next video.